So, Bryan Counter, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks so much, James, for having me back again.
We are going to be discussing your recently released book, Four Moments of Aesthetic Experience, reading Huysmans, Proust, McCarthy, and Cusk, and more broadly a discussion around literature and aesthetics. So before we, dive into aesthetics, this is sort of aesthetics is your bread and butter. So what's the origin of this book? Did this grow out of a thesis? Is this, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try not to be too in the weeds about the mundane and material ways of, that this book came about. But yes, this was like, pretty heavily revised and adapted from my dissertation. But if I had to think about the origin, it would definitely go back to even my undergrad studies, where I also wrote like a long thesis on Kant and Proust, who are kind of the twin central figures for many reasons, I guess, of this book. So I always had kind of felt that um, something that's like both critically relevant but also experientially relevant is that the first time that I read Kant and the first time that I read Proust were both these kind of like real reading experiences for me, like as a younger person, and that was also paired, of course, with just a real interest and investment in the sort of ways they had of thinking through aesthetic experience. And so I in terms of how maybe the framework came about, when I guess I will get a little boring with the material stuff for a second. When I was working on my dissertation, I originally planned to write a whole dissertation on Proust. That was kind of my original plan, because I had already published a few articles, and I figured that it would be easy enough for me to kind of cobble them together, and I sort of hit the wall with that and realized that I didn't have like a solid framework, and that maybe it's almost more difficult to take stuff you've already done as discrete pieces and put them together than it is to have a more general framework and work outward from there. So, on the advice of a friend, I kind of took I sort of stopped trying to write. I took a couple months and just read. And I read, kind of uncharacteristically for me, a bunch of more recent fiction. So I read um yeah, a whole list of more contemporary fiction. And two of the things that I read during that period were Remainder by Tom McCarthy and the Outline Trilogy by Rachel Cusk. And I realized, which was maybe it was almost like a Zen like realization that's so simple that you can't see it because it's right in front of you. I realized that there's a whole lot uh, of fiction that, whether it's thematized explicitly or not, is concerned with aesthetic experience in ways that really, um, resonate with the way I was already thinking about it in Proust, right? And so I realized that this kind of trying to force myself to write something on Proust only was kind of constraining. I read Remainder, I read the Outline Trilogy, and then it took a little bit of time, but then I kind of realized after a while that it would make the most sense to have four authors, and I kind of nicely have divided them between, turn of the century French and contemporary English. So I have Huysmans and Proust on the one hand, and then McCarthy and Cusk on the other. Um, and I think it was, a month or two later, I had this moment of insight where I realized, oh, I can take, Kant's four moments of the aesthetic judgment, or the judgment of taste, and maybe use that as a loose model for the four primary moments that I'm locating in each of these authors, right? And so that's where I realized that it's not only four authors, it's also four distinct uses, I guess, that I derive from each one. And actually, once I figured that general picture out, the writing kind of came really naturally. So I really that helped me really unlock the writing, and I ended up writing the initial draft at least pretty quickly, after I had that framework in mind.
So I guess to set a very, very broad foundation, what is an aesthetic experience?
Good question. Well, this is one. So I think, I mean, you probably will notice that in the book, the four moments I have, which I'll just quickly mention. So it's curation, quietness, violence, and disconnection or disconnectedness. Um, Two of those moments, as I kind of lay out, like two of them are negative and two of them are positive, and I'll say negative and positive kind of in quotation marks, because it's a lot more complicated than that. But sort of given that dichotomy, something I've noticed about myself as a thinker is that I tend to define things negatively, right? So I define things by what they are not oftentimes.
Mm.
In terms of trying to whittle away, like what is aesthetic experience, um, I find oftentimes that the best way for me to define it, at least in a way that I understand, is by saying what its limits are, what it's not. Like if I look at, and this is largely like why I turn to literature, right? Because in Kant, the example, while important, while fascinating, while stimulating, is still kind of never enough. Like the example in philosophy more broadly is, as I always think, like the rose in philosophy is something different from the rose in literature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the rose in philosophy for Kant is this, it's this exemplar of beauty because it's something that we come across in the forest and we have no concept for it. We see it for the first time. There's this kind of spontaneity to it. But then, of course, hundreds of years later, as we're reading this text again and again and again, like the rose takes on this kind of more sedimented quality, maybe. Whereas in Proust, when we have in one of the passages I talk about, we have a reference to a rose, that includes this kind of knowledge of Kant, but it also includes these twists and turns that we don't necessarily always get in a philosophical text. So maybe that's a roundabout way of preparing for myself to say that aesthetic experience is something where not only our normal ways of seeing things are kind of bracketed. That's like maybe the most kind of inclusive way I could put it, right? I think I cite somebody writing on Proust and Kant in the introduction who says that aesthetic experience is the moment where conceptual, ethical, and maybe like knowledge-based understanding of the world is kind of like put to the side, right? It doesn't disappear. It's not that aesthetic experience actually looks any one which way. It's actually this is why it's an experience, right? It's a way of feeling. Beyond that, I think I think it's really hard to say. I think maybe we'll get to it a little bit more as we go through the conversation, perhaps, because I don't really have like a canned definition for that, because I think it's a really you have to go zigzag a lot.
Okay. Would you say it's something you can only gesture towards, that it's kind of a true definite or a strict definition would be impossible? It would defeat it.
Yeah, I think that's for myself, that's probably what I would say. I think it involves a lot of sorry, it involves encounters, right? It involves like an encounter, for example, between philosophy and literature, or I can imagine, somebody writing a very different book where it's an encounter between science and painting, or it's an encounter between different disciplines, different mediums, and that encounter allows us to kind of see a new dimension or a new angle on it, right? And you can, of course, use like anecdotal examples, right? Which I'm usually a little bit hesitant to do, because you can describe what you think is the most amazing experience in the world into it's like describing a dream, right? It doesn't really translate, right? Mm-hmm. Because all you're describing is material, right? An aesthetic experience isn't really about material. It's about a dynamic, which doesn't always come through discursively, I'd say.
Words kind of lose us at that point.
Sure.
It's interesting. I mean, not to draw in another McCarthy, as we both know the novel. When we spoke about Suttree, there's the scene where he goes to the woods and McCarthy ends up using words like lovely. So it seems like the aesthetic experience at that point is sort of at the prey of now a dialogue or a writing that's so sincere you sort of you second guess it.
Yeah, it doesn't compute anymore, Mm-hmm. I think it's funny because I think in that conversation I actually mentioned The Wild Ass's Skin by Balzac, mm-hmm. which I sort of begin with. It's like my first actual literary example that I briefly talk about in the introduction. But there's kind of a parallel moment, and I know that Cormac McCarthy definitely read Balzac and probably would have read that novel. So I wonder if he's kind of gesturing toward that. But yeah, this moment where the character, after all this kind of complicated narrative that happens before, he just finds himself in the woods, living this kind of very, bare life, right? He's like living as he is nothing. Like he kind of takes up with this kind of I forget if they're farmers or what, but these kind of rural people who live in the woods, and he's just kind of he's just being, trying to be in nature without willing. The whole idea is that he's trying not to exert his will so much. Yeah.
Which is, well, it's an interesting question, because if that's what's happening in the novel, which is really what you're discussing in your book, which is around chance and chance, I guess, versus control, it seems that at the point of aesthetic experience, the role that's being played by chance in the book is equally a struggle for the author, because they can't sort of will chance. So something strange is happening when aesthetic experience is attempted to be explicitly described.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think a few thoughts here, I guess. On the one hand, that's one reason that for me, chance-based modes of artistic creation can only accidentally and almost despite themselves give us an aesthetic experience, right? I mean, we're not going to have an aesthetic experience by using the I Ching or whatever John Cage did, right? I mean, he does have some stuff that will give you an aesthetic experience, right? He has some really beautiful compositions, but I'm not sure that I've ever gotten an aesthetic experience listening to 433, for example, his famous silent piece. But on the other hand, I guess what I'll say is that this is also why the Balzac example begins, like the very beginning of the novel thematizes gambling, right? Like it's a novel where the character is going into a gambling hall and he's going to decide whether or not he will kill himself, essentially by how the roulette wager goes, right? And my argument there is that that's not actually the real chance of the novel, right? I mean, because it's too direct, because it maybe betrays that the kind of maybe ultimate, like nature of chance, or I'm not sure what the right word would be to use here, but the way that chance kind of actually pervades everything. It's not randomness, it's something else, right? And so like a chance discovery is just as much chance as randomly placing a bet without even knowing how the game works or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. So what role could you expand on that? Because it does seem to play such a big role in your book. I'm just wondering how that sort of computes when someone is writing a novel, and in what sense can that the notion of chance or something over will be brought in, because it's something that's being, this is getting a bit death of the author and sort of postmodern, because you're looking at the structure and construction of the writing whilst it's being written or amidst the writing. But to what extent, I guess, can the author as well put their will aside to allow some moments such as that to be, I guess, organic? Because the aesthetic experience, as you said, it can't be artificial.
Right, yeah. I'd say that when the author does it, this is actually where it's incumbent upon, readers and critics, whether you're a scholar or just a reader, I guess, to notice and to really pay close attention and closely read things. The example that jumps out to me, hopefully this will make sense, is in Against Nature by Huysmans. The narrator is we could call him classically like a control freak, right? He's a misanthrope. He basically builds himself this home where he has all these paintings, all this literature, all these kind of like flowers and perfumes, and he even what is it? He has like this kind of aquarium where he puts in different dyes so that the light goes through it in particular ways, so he's curate. I mean, that's the moment of curation, right? And this is one of the, what I call a negative moment, because that's always going to run up against a wall, right? A more simple kind of banal example would be, if I really want to have an aesthetic experience, I'm not necessarily going to do so by going to the museum, right? I mean, I can look at these amazing paintings, right? But there's something else operative because an object, and this will return, I guess, if we talk about remainder, my McCarthy, but the object can become something like a drug that has diminishing returns, I guess, if we try to seek aesthetic experience in the object, right? Just like you might seek a certain experience in a drug or something like that. But anyway, there's a moment in Against Nature where the narrator has this really elaborate carpet, and he just kind of thinks to himself, "Oh well, I need something to be moving around on it to really set off the colors, right? Because otherwise, it's this dull, which is kind of a crazy thought, right? Like the modern version would be like get a Roomba and put it on your carpet and have it move around and stuff like that, so you get uh, a little kinetic movement on the carpet there. So he decides to buy a tortoise. A couple ways that this involves chance, though. First, he finds the tortoise by chance. So he's walking around, and it's actually in the same like quarter of Paris, I think, where the narrator in Balzac is gambling. So it's kind of a funny little connection. I mean, the novels were written decades apart, but I wonder if that was an explicit little reference. I'm not sure. But he walks by the shop and sees a tortoise by chance, and he says, "Oh, I'm going to buy this." He takes the tortoise, brings it home. Its shell is too dull. It's not really doing it for him. So he says, "Okay, well, I forget the order, but he gets it both gilded and bejeweled," right? So he sends it out once. It comes back, it's gilded. He's like, "Well, that's better, but it's not good enough." He sends it back again. He picks out all these jewels, and he says, "Okay, now here we go. This is the real stuff. It's gilded and bejeweled. It's going to really reflect the light on this carpet." So when the tortoise comes back and it's finally complete, right? It's, walking around slowly on the carpet, and then it kind of disappears from the narrative, right? So he kind of like has this weird, it's kind of like an involuntary memory, or like a proto involuntary memory, the way that we get it in Proust. I mean, this is before Proust, of course, and Huysmans was a definitely an influence on Proust, but the tortoise we don't really hear anything about for several pages, and eventually we find out when the narrator does kind of come back to it, or the protagonist does kind of go check on the tortoise is dead because it's been crushed under its own weight from all these jewels and everything. But the other way that I would say this kind of involves chance is that during that whatever kind of proto involuntary memory, we have this like 2-line paragraph or 2-sentence paragraph that just describes the way that it's snowing outside. I don't have the exact like lines in front of me, but essentially it's like we have this awful description of a memory where our protagonist has had to go get a tooth pulled because he has this abscess or whatever is going on with his tooth. And during that, we just have a break, and it just says, outside, the house was silent, it was snowing, everything was crystalline. I'm kind of paraphrasing here. And so that to me is a moment of like, even though we don't know who's saying that, I mean, it's this omniscient narrator, I guess. We don't know if the narrator if the protagonist even kind of notices that it's snowing, right? Because he's so lost in his reverie that he's in. But that to me seems a way that even if it's not occurring to this specific character, that's a way that aesthetic experience will still kind of emerge or erupt into something despite the control that is trying to be exerted over it, right? Mm-hmm. So even I might say like, who cares about the museum, like objects don't, give me aesthetic experience. It's always random. There's always going to be this chance. I can still go, of course, to the museum and have an amazing aesthetic experience looking at a certain painting. It's just that that's going to happen whether I am, trying for it or not. So there's almost like there's the alignment too much with chance. There's the alignment too much with control. Mm-hmm. And there's some combination of those two things where aesthetic experience is, and it's not aligned with either of them, really, right? If that hopefully that makes sense.
That makes sense. I mean, but it brings us to the question of you can't really seek it. You can't hold, and you also can't hold it. It seems to have duration, and then it's gone, and it also can't really be remembered. So it's completely its own thing that can't be grasped. It just is.
Right, and this is something I still wonder about, I mean, um to stick with Huysmans again, maybe, and to talk a little bit about Proust. um there is a sense, and I kind of, yeah, I think about this a lot, and I wonder if it's true, and I'm not sure if it's even like possible to come down definitively about this. There's a sense for me in which aesthetic experience is only, it's like it brings to mind Freud's, what is it, Nachträglichkeit, like afterwardsness, right? Like it's an experience that we only really have after the fact, kind of, right? Or it's only recognizable after the fact, right? And this is why I think the shift, it's a subtle shift. I'm sure I'm not the first person who's made this gesture, right? But talking about aesthetic experience rather than aesthetic judgment, because judgment seems to give this kind of causal form to what's happening, right? Whereas experience is a little bit more, those lines between the subject and the object maybe are a little bit more blurry. But there's also a different maybe temporality, right? Like experience is something that, I think you're right to say there's a duration to aesthetic experience, but there's maybe also a different like element of temporality where I might not know that I've had an aesthetic experience until I look back on it, right?
Yeah.
The way that Huysmans comes into this is that there's a passage where, and I think I might be mistaken, it might actually be after he's been reading a bunch of Dickens or something, right? But he has this fantasy that he wants to go on a trip to London.
Mm-hmm.
So what he does is he goes to an English themed bar close to his house, and he kind of like imagines that he's gone on this trip. He has like an imaginary voyage, basically, right? And what he says that's really crucial there, and I think is correct, is that, well, the real stuff that, or what this implies at least, is that the real stuff we remember about a trip, say, are the things that we weren't focused on when we were actually on the trip, right? So he's trying to sort of short circuit this like weird interstitial thing that happens when we have an experience, which is that it's always the stuff we didn't focus on that will come back to us. And this is what Proust, I think, a lot of his examples of involuntary memory are about that, right? I mean, the famous opening involuntary memory with the Madeleine, he has the sip of tea with the pastry, and that's the thing that kind of opens up this whole writing project for him. But of course, when he was a kid, it's not like he was sitting around sipping tea and, wow, this is such a good aesthetic experience. No, it's just that this is the material, this is the formal material thing that remains, that stays the same. But even that is not something that you can engineer or like choose out in advance to be the trigger later on for a sort of experience.
Do you want to expand on that just in relation to the difference between aesthetic judgment and aesthetic experience? It seems something is taken away when you move from judgment to experience.
Sure. I mean, well, I guess just methodologically, like I'm not concerned in this book about calling something beautiful or sublime, right? I mean, judgment confers a kind of status onto something, right? And I think that this is already, not to get too deconstructive, I guess, this is already threatened from within by Kant in a certain way, right? Like even, I mean, he says in the Analytic of the Sublime, in the third critique, he says that we do not speak properly when we call some object of nature sublime. What is sublime is not in the object, it's in the human mind.
Mm.
But I would also kind of argue that the same is true of the beautiful, although he doesn't say the same thing about the beautiful. So it's not that, uh, it's not that every single rose you ever see is going to be beautiful, right?
Mm.
It's not. I mean, they're going to look probably similar, and it's not even a question of like a rose looking nicer or smelling better, or it's not about superlatives or degrees of beauty, right? It's about this kind of internal event of a certain experience, right? And so that's why I mean, just on the kind of basic way, right? I mean, you can. I think this gets complicated already with a lot of the avant-garde art, literature, art, music, whatever of the 20th century, right? I mean, we've always been trying to subvert this stuff in a certain way, and oftentimes it's kind of oppositional, right? So rather than do formalist painting, or rather than paint figuratively, I'm going to splash paint around, or I'm not even going to paint at all. I'm going to have this object, or I'm going to have a black square, or I'm going to have a urinal or whatever. um but I think that if art is, I mean, not that this is necessarily what art is, but if, for me, if I'm thinking about art as kind of an investigation into aesthetic experience, then it can't be oppositional, right? It has to be something else. And I think that trying to contain and acknowledge the dynamic that happens in life, right? I mean, this is also, I'm looking at literature, but I'm also thinking about like how this stuff happens in life, both for the characters, but also, more broadly, or from my own experience. It's never an objective distinction, or if it is an objective distinction that gives you an aesthetic experience, it's under really specific circumstances. So again, I'll say, like, it's not every time I go to the museum and look at the Monet, I'm going to have this experience where what did I say, my concepts and ethics and whatever are suspended. Of course not. No, I'm just a museum goer, right? But I might have one day where, whatever else, like whatever variables are at play, do facilitate that, right? And that's where the chance comes in. It's not random, but it is not calculable, and it's not based on my will. I mean, there is a certain kind of passivity, I think, to these experiences that so I think, like, the gesture of moving from judgment to experience, I could do, and I should, I guess, do a lot more research on that, and maybe flesh that out more. But it's largely a gesture of, and look, I'm not trying to fetishize total passivity. I'm not saying, I've already said I'm not about randomness, right? I'm not saying, oh, I'll roll the dice and that'll determine if I'm going to have an aesthetic experience or not. No, this is, I think there's a rigor to this, but the difference is that I'm not, I don't think it's about going out into the world as a subject who judges and points at things and says, this is beautiful, this is sublime, this is ugly, this is monstrous, whatever. It's not about that. There's a real kind of seriousness to these experiences that maybe precludes the possibility of doing that, like, in a certain way, especially if aesthetic experience isn't recognizable until after the fact. I would say that I probably can't say anything when I'm having an aesthetic experience, like
there's no ethical dimension here. There's no sort of, there almost seems to be no purpose to these other than as an experience themselves.
I mean, I guess, so this is something I've always kind of struggled with in Kant. I think there is an ethical dimension, but it's an ethical dimension that comes after the fact, I think. Okay. That's how I would think about it, right? So, like, if you have real experiences of beauty, that is going to affect you ethically, right? Probably not in the moment, probably on reflection, right? And maybe that might even be a better way of defining what aesthetic judgment is, right? Is judging not an object, but judging your own experience of an object after the fact. However, I also don't think that aesthetic experience makes you like a better person. Maybe it makes you a deeper person, a more thoughtful person, which I would say is ethical, right? I mean, I don't know. Ethics always has to just be about, ethics and morals aren't the same thing, right? I mean, there's a difference there, and I'm not a moral philosopher or anything like that, but yeah, I would say, certainly this leaves a mark, right? This is something that you have to kind of contend with, and it's something that, I mean, aesthetic experiences too. One thing I'll say, they're not, and this is maybe another subtle departure from certain other, like, traditions or trends in the philosophy. I don't necessarily think they're always like explicitly pleasurable, I mean, I know I've already said, like, I'm not concerned about beautiful, sublime, whatever. I'm not trying to talk about this whole, taxonomy of categories or whatever, but I also think that aesthetic experiences can be kind of neutral, but they still, upon reflection, yeah, they can lend, or they can have an ethical dimension when we puzzle. I mean, I'm thinking about maybe some of the conversations with Steve Nepper about wonder, right? This is also like closely linked to wonder, I think. I don't have like a real systematic way of thinking about this, but when we wonder about the fact that we can have an experience with an object that maybe we see every single day. Maybe I pick up a spoon that I eat with every morning, and suddenly there's a moment where I'm looking at it one day and it's obviously not about the spoon. This is the thing. Like the object itself is kind of almost virtual, right? It's there, right? It's the trigger for the experience. And this is where I think Proust is really important here. He's talking about objects as both there and kind of not there, right? Like the aesthetic experience in Proust is both about and not about the thing that is there. And I think that's something that causes wonder in us, right? I mean, we have to think about our place in the universe or our lives or whatever if we can have these experiences seemingly for no reason, seemingly with no purpose. And I think that actually, rather than being a negative thing, the uselessness or the purposelessness of these experiences is itself something kind of amazing, right? I mean, it's a way of getting the economy of every single day. I'm sure you're the same, right? It's like, okay, what do I have to do today? What's my checklist of stuff today? How many things can I cross off the list today, right? And this is true for everyone, right? This is anyone. Whatever your job is, you have stuff to do, even if it's, chores or taking care of a pet or a kid or whatever it is, or going to work. You have things to do all the time. And yet, in the midst of that, there are these moments that kind of allow you to like take a step out of that, and those moments, I would say, this is paradoxical, but I love paradoxes. These moments are there's a timelessness to them, I think. Even though they're time bound.
Are these moments to be trusted? Because this is we're sort of tiptoeing around it, but there's some narrator, there's some subject, there's some being that is being, but it's not the usual form of willed and control and maybe even on rails. So these are moments as ruptures. Are they really to be trusted? And what is it to, I guess, hand over some trust to them? Because, I mean, speaking of sort of real life, many people's aesthetic moments, which could also be somewhat synonymous with moments of wonder or almost like miracles, can completely overhaul people's lives, and they are beyond doubt. So I wonder what it is to trust these. And I guess also what it is to trust these in literature as well. Like with the McCarthy thing, there's just this, the Cormac McCarthy, this hint of little words coming in like lovely. It's almost like, this is too much. Like, is this like almost Edenically, I shouldn't trust this, or like, in memory, is it untrustworthy with, sorry, there's a lot there.
No, I think that's a good and really complicated question. I mean, to trust, and this is something, I've been thinking about too, like how true are these moments, or how are they true? Are they true, right? And I think like the way I would think about this is, I'm not trying to be totally perspectivist and say that there's only subjective truths or things like that. But I do think that if we're thinking about an aesthetically based or an aesthetically inflected truth, then it is a truth of something that does go beyond fact, right? I mean, just like it's like you can have a moment in your day where you have to be productive, make the money, go do the groceries, clean up your whatever, sweep your kitchen floor or whatever. There's something, those are facts or those are duties or whatever, but there's still something else of being, which is not, I think is maybe just inarticulable, right? I don't think we can, there's a truth that we can't say. I mean, and I'm coming at this from a totally, pretty much secular approach, right? So I'm like, I tend to be sort of skeptical or allergic to stop, things that I would say maybe vulgarly as like kind of stopgaps that would explain away, experience. So I don't like to, even concepts, right? I'm not just talking about religion. I'm talking even about concepts, like a concept like X, Y, or Z to me already feels a little bit too much, Because I think that these things, we can communicate to a certain extent. But communication takes two, and it therefore folds back in this realm of experience, right? So to talk about literature for a second, I mean, maybe it's worth looking at the example of Proust. Like, Um, and he was obviously concerned about this. This is the huge theme of his writing, but there are moments in Proust where his narrator theorizes something, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's has an aesthetic theory. The whole end of the novel, a lot of people have written about this. The whole big chunk of the end of the novel reads like an essay where he's talking about how he, near the end of his life or, later in life, he realizes that because of all these involuntary memories he's had, there must be a timeless self, a kind of almost like metaphysical self who exists throughout time and can, who we can access from time to time based on these material things. And that, I mean, sure. I mean, that is a different way of maybe saying some of what I've already been talking about and some of the stuff that I'm already looking at in the book, I guess. But to phrase it that way to me feels like already the kind of intervention of a sort of system that, maybe put it this way, like if the system isn't recognizable in a specific moment, then I feel a little bit more skeptical of it,
Mm.
It's like you have to take, so even in Proust, right, there are these moments where, this is maybe a better way to phrase the truth thing or whether it can be trusted. I trust the moments that aren't theorized more than the moments that are, because the moments that are theorized are this kind of discursive, they rely on philosophical language, they feel scripted. But then there are these moments, and this is why the Proust chapter talks about what I call quiet moments, right? There are these moments that pass by that aren't theorized, that also put the burden on me as a reader or a critic to even notice them in the first place, And like a lot of these moments haven't really been addressed that much in the scholarship,
Mm.
one, but they're also not really addressed by the narrator, right? So like the Madeleine moment at the beginning of the novel, that's the most famous moment, one of the hugest, you'll find a million things written about it, and the narrator keeps kind of he'll refer back to it, right?
Yeah.
But there are moments where he has an aesthetic experience because of the weather and how it feels outside. There's actually explicitly no object there, which I find to be philosophically interesting. But also, he doesn't ever, go back and say, "Ah, remember that time where I had this?" It's like no, it's not theorized, and that to me gives it a kind of a quiet truth that I trust because there's something that feels really singular there, uh, that isn't trying to be proven, right? It's not. It's kind of allowed to breathe a little bit. So maybe hopefully that's it's a
Yeah.
little round way of answering your question, but
What are the limits then of analyzing texts in the aesthetic mode? Is it really this limit of, well, you can't get to a point where you're explaining it away or conceptualizing it?
so this maybe takes me to a question about that I think about often, which is, obviously I'm coming from a comparative literature background, which is really philosophy heavy and theory heavy or whatever, as opposed to something that's more either archival based or genealogical scholarship or like linguistic or whatever, right? And so one limit inherent already in what I'm doing is that I'm, there's a pretty limited attention to, even though I'm close reading, I'm not necessarily like thinking about the poetics of the text or the sonorous qualities of the language or anything like that. So that's one limit that's within, I guess, what I'm doing. But in terms of a limit of like a broader limit across texts, I guess we could say,
Mm.
I would say that the limit is the limit between the text you're looking at and the philosophy or the ideas that you're bringing to it. So in my mind, whenever I'm, close reading a text and trying to make some kind of argument, usually, of course, usually about aesthetic experience, uh, my hope or my goal or my task in that moment is usually to not only, I mean, certainly not to apply a theory to the literary text, but not only not to fit a theory onto it, but actually hopefully to expand my understanding of both of those texts, right? So reading Proust helps me understand Kant better, and vice versa, right? Reading Remainder helped me understand certain problems in Kant as well, right? Just as much as I have to think about Kant to understand what's happening in Remainder, right? And always, again, there's still this kind of third aspect of all this, which is I'm also a person who's coming at these texts from my own reading experience, but also like life, just experience of understanding what it is that I think I'm talking about, which I think is both a challenge but also a benefit of using, of thinking about a theme like aesthetic experience. It's a real thing, it's not some concept that was just made up, it's something that we can recognize. And I think actually I do think even, you could use it and you use different terms to describe it or something, but I would say it's an experience that most people will kind of, you can explain and people will know what you mean, right? It's not some kind of weird concept of, uh, I'm not trying to rag on, like deconstruction or whatever, right? But deconstruction will oftentimes take up, concepts like hospitality or something, and they'll kind of like take an everyday concept and make it somehow a little bit, they'll deconstruct it, which is an important thing to do. But aesthetic experience is something you could walk up to someone on the street and say, like, okay, what's the last time you were listening to music and you felt, really intense about it or something like that? That's step one. Step two would be, okay, what's the last time you felt that just in your life without necessarily having any art attached to it? Because that's really what I'm trying to kind of think about. So in terms of the limits of this kind of analysis, I mean, I think it really depends on your definition, first of all, of like what is aesthetic. I mean, today we use aesthetics in a way that usually refers to style or kind of like modes of presentation, like, you'll hear people saying like, that's totally your aesthetic, or whatever, right? Which is obviously not what I'm talking about, because I'm trying to actually question the role of the object in the first place, right? And style in the first place. This is not really, I mean, incidentally, of course, I've picked like some, pretty major writers,
Yeah.
so
Well, I should have asked this earlier, but why is it these four?
So yeah, so I guess as I've already said, Proust and Kant I see as being kind of like really close together in my thinking about this about aesthetic experience. Huysmans I had read back in undergrad, and his novel is just so challenging, and so it's a really hard very boring novel to read. But I've also found out more and more that I tend to really uh latch on to things where kind of nothing that much happens, so that's maybe my own little personal thing. So yeah, I returned to it. I guess Huysmans was actually kind of the last thing I added in after I had read McCarthy and Cusk. So why McCarthy and Cusk? Well, I think I said already, like, I had taken off this time to just kind of read, and I did find in these texts, like these moments of description that felt like different angles on aesthetic experience that, of course, they have a very different style from Proust, right? And they're very different types of narratives. They're much shorter, obviously, but also their language is a lot more kind of accessible. And I think that was something that I really liked too, is that, it's not these really long sentences or these kind of complicated twists and turns like in Proust. They're kind of these shorter uh sentences that you would hear real people saying, I guess, contra to Proust. Um, but they still got at the heart, I think, at certain really important aspects of what I was trying to look at, like different dimensions, I guess, of aesthetic experience. And so once I figured out I wanted to write about McCarthy and Cusk in addition to Proust, then I thought, okay, well, what else? And then Huysmans just, I think, had already been on my mind, kind of, and so I went back and reread his book, which it is hard to know what to do with that book. But I do think that it nicely sets up. And I guess I should say also, like, the four moments in the book are kind of paired. So they're already two pairs, like two French writers, two contemporary English writers, but then there's two negative moments and two positive moments. And it nicely goes Huysmans negative, Proust positive, McCarthy negative, Cusk positive, right?
Hmm.
So there's a turn of the century French writer and contemporary English writer for both negative and positive. So there are a lot of kind of like crisscrosses. And I guess the last thing I'll say too is that uh, I would say you can find these four moments in any of the four authors. It's just that they the examples I use kind of I think illuminate each of those moments pretty nicely. I'll also say too, these are not like meant to be determinate or exhaustive categories at all. You know, I kind of just came up with these four moments as a way to almost paraphrase or draw out some of the implications of Kant's four moments of aesthetic judgment, which are disinterestedness, purposiveness without purpose, universality, and communicability, right? And so I think like the four moments that I kind of came up with are they're not supposed to align with them. I'm not saying this is what Kant meant or anything like that. I'm not trying to make any crazy statements like that. But I do think they, the kind of angles or the spins that I put on them help to, at least for myself, to articulate some of the stuff that you really need to kind of pull apart from Kant's four moments.
If there is such a vector, how do you think readers should approach aesthetic experiences, especially within literature?
I mean, this is a tricky question because, thinking about readers in general, I do think, I mean, maybe sounds like kind of stupid to say. I do think, of course, when you're reading literature, it is anyone would benefit from at least like reading a good summary of Kant's third critique. Like I truly believe that when I read in my undergrad, I read the third critique. For whatever perverse reason, I loved the experience of reading it. Like I returned to it with pleasure. I've read it several times, but it also really unlocked something about, look, I had already read a bunch of this French, whatever deconstruction stuff. And I thought, okay, this is like cool, whatever. But thinking about aesthetic experience is something that's real that we experience before we ever know the term for it,
Yeah.
before we even necessarily have read, like as a kid, I had this experience playing video games. I had it reading, I had it playing music, I had it just at the beach. I don't know, like we have these experiences from time to time, and it's important. I think, I mean, this is where the ethical thing comes in, right? If we just have those and you just say, oh, that was nice, okay, I guess I'll wait for the next one or whatever, you never reflect on it, then you're maybe missing out, but I also, of course, it enriches the way you understand literature, and it's especially once you understand that it's not about going to literature and trying to decide, well, is this an example of the sublime? Is this an example of the beautiful? Like, it's not about that at all. It's about these dynamics of experience that are very special. It's a special mode of experience it's one kind of experience that we can't will ourselves into, It's something that happens to us that I'm sure probably most people, there's no way to know this, but I'm sure most people in the world have had an aesthetic experience at least once, right?
Yeah.
Even if they never have heard that term at all before. And I think it's important. I mean, it's largely, one of the things that makes life worth living. And it, once we start seeing that literature isn't just about reading big books or reading the newest kind of literature or whatever, but it is about, I think as David Foster Wallace said, literature is about what it is to be a fucking human being or whatever that question is. It is, it is. I mean, that sounds like dumb to say or kind of simple or reductive, but it is. It's about real things, and we can get as, formalist or technical about it as we want. And those things are helpful. I mean, I do that a little bit too, right? To think about how something is said, the word choice, whatever, right? But all that does is to help us understand the nuances of the experiences that are being described.
Is there anything you'd like to add about your book or aesthetic experience you feel is key to add in?
I don't think so. I think we've covered it pretty well
without going into the specifics of each writer. And yeah, yeah. I mean, what would you like people to take from your book?
I mean, I hope it's, I don't know. I mean, I would hope that it's like approachable enough. I think that you could read. I mean, yeah, and I guess maybe I will talk a little bit about the I've already talked about Huysmans and Proust. I mean, the chapter on Tom McCarthy deals with the moment of violence, and it's, I mean the term violence in a couple different ways. Like Remainder is a violent book. It involves some deaths and things like that, and some murders, a lot of waste, and sadly, a number of cats die, which is something that I never like to read about. Um, but there's also a violence that's born from a misunderstanding, and that's the way I kind of mean it. And what I mean there is that, if you haven't read Remainder, it's a book where a guy who wins a lawsuit, who for being in this kind of accident that occurs before the beginning of the novel, he wins £8.5 million, doesn't know what to do with it. But then he goes to a party, sees this crack in the wall, has an intense experience of deja vu, and then begins just reenacting things. So if people know this show, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but it's kind of similar to Nathan Fielder's show, The Rehearsal, where he's like rehearsing these scenarios and then trying to put them into play, and the boundary between real life and acting becomes incredibly tricky.
Yeah.
Uh, so that happens in the book, and the kind of argument I want to make there is that he he keeps ramping up his reenactments. They get more and more extreme, but the whole time he's after the same experience, right? Which is a kind of aesthetic experience. And this is where maybe I'm kind of responding uh, a little bit to the idea of like addiction or appetite for aesthetic experience, right? It's like there is a paradox where the paradox for myself, right? I think about aesthetic experience daily,
Mm.
but it's hard to not want to go seek it out, right? Because I'm thinking constantly about how important it is and how enlivening it is, right? So that's what I talk about there. And with the Cusk trilogy, her excellent outline trilogy, I focus on these moments where characters, and this is actually something that happens throughout her entire body of work, which I find really fascinating, where characters refer to these moments where they feel outside of narrative or outside of plot or outside of a story. And I think maybe that's something I haven't really touched on, is that, aesthetic experience kind of what it does is it brackets certain modes of thinking and experiencing that we have. So even if I'm at work as a computer programmer, maybe I'm looking at a line of code and I suddenly feel this kind of, not necessarily out of body, but this kind of aesthetic experience. I'm probably not thinking about how much money I'm going to make that week or that year or whatever, right? It
Mm.
brings me out of that. It's a more kind of, it's both grounded but also like elsewhere kind of experience. It does something weird with the subject. Um, but it also brings you out of the story of your day and I think your life, right? You become something else for the duration that you are there, I guess. And so that's what I focus on there. So I guess in short, I would say that you could read the chapters if you're interested in any of these authors, but I honestly, I think like the core ideas that I'm trying to set out in the introduction are pretty important for me. I do think they're helpful for reading literature and also just for reflecting on your own experiences. And eventually, I'm certainly gonna, I think, come back to this idea in another project and try to kind of build a little bit more on it. I'm not sure
Yeah.
exactly yet.
Are you working on anything to do with aesthetic experience now, or are you taking a break?
I think even if I don't call it that, I always will be. The big next kind of, other than some articles and things like that, the big next book project is actually, I think I may have mentioned it last time, but we're starting to like work on it in earnest now, is a an edited volume on Proust that I'm co-editing with James Dutton, who's a really excellent Proust scholar from Australia. And that's under contract with Bloomsbury. So we've been getting our uh, chapters in. I'm writing a chapter. James and I will be writing a long introduction for that. And we have like an article that we co-authored that I'm not sure exactly when it's coming out, but I think it will be open access. So that's something that I'd maybe can, if people are interested, I can send that. It's going to be kind of a sort of a preview, I think, of what our introduction will end up being. But it's a whole book about, it's largely about aesthetic experience in very different ways because we have a bunch of different contributors. And of course, the title "Quiet Proust" is coming out of my, this idea of quiet moments in Proust. Um, and then the other thing I'm working on is I actually started a podcast called "Authors Die Twice." So it's a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory, but also to some extent literature. I mean, I think the video game angle is so my co-host Nathan Wainstein and I were both, I think like for both of us, like literature and video games are kind of like these twin interests that have sort of followed us throughout our lives since kids. And I mean, he works, more both on literature, but also he works more than I do on games. Like he actually has a book on the 2015 game Bloodborne, which is really excellent. But yeah, we actually just had an episode out where we talk about The Wall by Haushofer, who I'm sure your listeners are fans of. So yeah, that there's that too. Those are kind of the main things for now.
Cool. Wow. All right. I'll be sure to put the links for Four Moments Aesthetic Experience, which big thank you to Anthem Press for sending me a review copy, and also for your podcast. I'll put both those things in the description below. Bryan Counter, thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.